Welcome to a special series where we interview a host of notable people from the Genius 100 Summit in Los Cabos, Mexico, on the moment that changed everything. Here, you'll learn their secrets to success, gain invaluable insights into what shaped their careers, and key takeaways on what it takes to be a leader in their field.
This is absolutely what we need. This is absolutely the future. We have to get on this.
Talk to people who think so beautifully about big, complex challenges.
G100 Los Cabos, a special series on the moment that changed everything.
What was your first job? First paid job?
My first paid job was working as a busboy at a restaurant in Snowmass, Colorado. I had gone there to ski with my family in the winter of 72, 73. We had vacation there, and I was in between my freshman and sophomore year of college, and I stayed on. Actually, my very first job there was working as a maintenance man, cleaning out the spa and toilets and taking icicles off the roofs of the Tamarack Lodge at Snowmass, Colorado, not far from Aspen. In those days, these were separate mountains. They're all connected now, Snowmass, Aspen Highlands, and Aspen. But that was my first paid job. I was 17 years old, and as I say, in between my freshman and sophomore years of college at Amherst College.
Amherst, okay. Where were you born?
Born in New York City. Born at the Klingenstein Pavilion in Mount Sinai Hospital, October 8, 1954.
You're kidding. Okay, so your family, what were your parents like?
Well, my parents are remarkable. Both my parents were Holocaust survivors, so that already puts them in a special category, certainly for me and my brother. Dad passed in 2019, was a remarkable man in many dimensions. We could talk about him. Mom is still alive at 92 years young and remembers everything that happened to her, literally from the age of 3, her idyllic life up to 1941. When the Nazis invaded the part of southeastern Poland, now western Ukraine, that she and Dad came from. And then she was orphaned. She lost her entire family of over 100 individuals, survived as an orphan for almost 2 years, hiding as a Ukrainian peasant, working in farms in the Ukraine until liberated by the Russians in 1944, which is really paradoxical considering that today in that same part of the world there's a terrible war going on and the Russians are the aggressors and the Ukrainians, who then were collaborators with the Nazis. And my mother talks about this in great detail in her writings and in the documentary we made about her, how the world has changed. But so both my parents came to this country after surviving the Holocaust. Mom in 1947, Dad in 1949. Dad had learned a trade. He was a mechanic. And through a series of coincidences and accidents of fate, was introduced to a line of equipment which he acquired the rights to and optimized, and he became a very successful individual selling and financing equipment into the laundry and dry cleaning industry, with laundromats and dry cleaning plants throughout North America and distribution of capital equipment, heavy-duty machinery, and then he built manufacturing facilities and sold all that off to a public company, which was our first family liquidity event. So I grew up in a environment of intellectual activity. Mom became a teacher of Slavic languages and literature. Dad is a successful businessman. And somehow or other, in the middle of all of that, I ended up being interested in science and medicine and went to medical school. My brother went to law school. And here we are.
So where did your parents meet?
That's another interesting story, one that we're in the process of making a documentary about, called After the Final No. They met in a displaced persons camp outside of Munich, Germany. There's a whole story here after the Holocaust of those who survived had been displaced from the countries of origin. In the case of my parents, Poland, Ukraine, and camps were set up under the auspices of the Allies. And mom was in Fernwald, DP camp, and dad in Landsberg. And my father survived with a older sister and actually two brothers. He lost a sister and brother and parents and cousins. And the mom was and 5 years younger than dad, and she visited the apartment where my father was living with his older sister. And they weren't actually introduced to meet one another, but they met that one time in Munich. Dad had just come out of the DP camp. He was a bit older. Mom was still in the camp after she'd been in an orphanage. And then they met many years later after they had both emigrated to the United States. And, from in those days, if you were part of different communities, whether it was from Poland or from Germany or, wherever your origins were, people knew one another and connected with one another. And mom and dad were introduced 1950, 51, and married in 53, and I was born in 54.
Whoa. And your brother?
Neil is 3.5 years younger than me. He was born in 58 on Long Island. I was born in Manhattan, and we were living in the Bronx. And then mom was pregnant with Neil, and dad's business was starting to succeed. The 50s were an era of great economic growth, especially in the United States, and opportunity. And we moved to Long Island, to a middle-class community, West Hempstead. And my brother was born in February of 58. And we lived in West Hempstead until my bar mitzvah in 1967, when we moved to the South Shore of Long Island, to a, I would say, upper class community, the Five Towns, which many people have heard of. And we lived in Lawrence on the South Shore of Long Island.
So I got to assume that your dad building a business when you were young, and because of the work ethic, obviously Holocaust survivors, did you spend more time with your dad or your mom?
Really, with both of them. They were both very busy. And the attitude then was, let the children figure out what directions they want to go in, but provide a foundation for education. It was seen, and it's always been true before our family and since then, that education is the door to opportunity. And as my father used to say, education is only wasted on the uneducated. And, the idea of exceeding and excelling, I should say, educationally, academically, was never imposed upon us. You must get A's, or you must be top of your class, or if you don't do well, then you're not going to be able to achieve anything in life. There was none of that kind of pressure. It was just a given that learning mattered. And my mother, who was 16 when she came to this country, was able to go to high school. And as I've heard from cousins on my mother's side, she came here not speaking a word of English, and very quickly learned English. Was quite astonishing. Rose to the top of her class in Far Rockaway High School. Ended up going to college, going to graduate school. Was offered to go to get a PhD. She got a master's in languages and later in education. But Dad was older and had to work. So really had both sides of the equation. The practical, business-oriented, one step after another, build your success brick by brick, as well as the more academic and, take the time to really be educated, see the breadth and depth of possibilities of careers, and, become a self-learner. And I think both of those is what I've carried with me all my life. So they had, to your question, really an equal influence. We took family vacations. Dad was a very hardworking individual building his business. He traveled a lot, but when he was home, he was with us. And Mom took on a teaching position around in my mid-teens, and was a very dedicated teacher of Slavic languages and literature. but it was never a sense that our parents weren't there for us. But we were pretty self-motivated, both my brother and I, and didn't need a lot of hand-holding.
When did you decide you wanted to be a doctor?
Well, the story that's told, and I have memories of this. When I was in third grade, I had the mumps, and it was a significant case of the mumps. And at one point, apparently, I was running a terrible fever. It's a virus, so there's no antibiotics that can treat it. It has to run its course. And I fell off the bed, and I had quite a pain in my abdomen, and it turned out that I had an inflamed appendix which ruptured. So I ended up having to be rushed to surgery in the local hospital. Had what I now know as a physician, basically had sepsis, was put on strong antibiotics, was in the hospital for a few weeks, missed a month and a half of school, and I came out with this experience of these physicians and nurses and the care and the environment, and hearing the story of how close to not making it happened. And at that point I said, I want to be a doctor when I grow up. And of course I was already interested in science and things that were quantitative. I was good in math. So both my academic inclinations as well as this personal experience at an early age sort of prompted me to be interested in science and medicine. I subsequently particularly excelled in academics. I ended up skipping 2 years of school. So I started college when I was 16. And
Are you serious?
Yeah.
2 years?
Yeah. So I did.
So you were pretty young when you went into university.
Yeah, I started
Like way younger than everybody, which is a little...
a year younger. I also, because of the birthday. So I instead of doing 2 years of pre-K, did 1 year of pre-K and kindergarten. So that would have put me a year ahead, and then skipped from third to fifth grade. So after this whole incident, playing catch up academically because I'd been out, and maybe that, it's hard to sort of look back on it with full insight, prompted me to be even more focused on academics. And
Tougher to meet girls.
yeah, in retrospect, skipping grades, it has elements which are to be helpful, but there are also elements emotionally, developmentally. At some point you catch up, but I never felt that. I mean, this was the 60s, and there was a lot of very easygoing behavior, shall we say, and the community that I grew up in West Hempstead, most of my playmates were from the local area. We lived in a court, so all the kids would come there to play, and we were all pretty athletic. But I would say as you get into junior and senior high school, there can be sort of a dislocation temporarily, but that passes, pretty quickly once you get into university, and you're sort of on your own path.
What sports did you do?
Played a lot of tennis.
Serious?
Yeah, tennis and skiing. Yeah, I love tennis. Was never a great tennis player. Doubles, not singles.
However, doubles, you need a forehand, a backhand, a serve, and a volley.
Yes, you do.
Right?
Exactly.
In singles, you don't need all that.
Yeah. Big serve and and a net game. Enjoyed tennis, and we lived near a country club, and would go to the courts there, and did some teaching for the tennis pro there when I was in high school.
So you're making serious money compared to your friends.
It was more volunteer and getting free court time. I wasn't making much. I had a newspaper route when I was in West Hempstead, but I'm not going to pretend that I grew up with all kinds of jobs, as a young teenager, and learned the value of hard work that way. The hard work for me and my brother was focusing on academics, given the family background, really taking pride in and participating in our Jewish heritage, but not overly so. There are members of my family Orthodox, and that was never something that was part of our upbringing. But it was just a pretty balanced, normal, Long Island middle class experience, which continued into college days. As I said, I was at Amherst College from 71 71, 72. Oh, then an interesting took place. Well, I grew up in a family where many languages were spoken. Of course, both my parents spoke English, but when they didn't want the kids to know what was going on, they spoke Polish or Yiddish. And Yiddish, at least I got a pretty good handle on. So they would be speaking Yiddish, especially with aunts or uncles, and I knew what they were talking about. And then when I had to choose a foreign language in high school, it was sort of a natural to choose German, where there's a lot of connection. Right. And also, even then, the idea of, well, if you're interested in becoming a doctor, German was always considered to be the language of science and medicine, even, post-World War II. But traditionally, in Europe, German was the language of science. And so I studied German, and because of the Yiddish background or just being around languages, became very good at it. And while I was a senior in high school in Lawrence, was reading either Der Stern or Das Bild or one of the magazines, and there was an advertisement looking for American students who could speak German to work at the 1972 Olympic Games. And I applied with a recommendation from my German teacher, and lo and behold, I was accepted to be a Dolmetscher Platzanweiser, a translator, sort of seat watcher, and I worked in the boxing hall of the Munich Olympics in the same area that Howard Cosell was located, and I got to meet and know Howard Cosell a bit. And of course, the most memorable, you might say, and tragic part of the Munich Olympics was was Black September, was the murder of the Israeli athletes. And I was in Munich as a child of two Holocaust survivors when this event happened.
How did that affect you?
Well, at the time, it was so unexpected that you're not really processing it fully. And they shut down the whole Olympic Stadium. And up to that point, the games had been idyllic. The stadium was extraordinary. The whole German people were reintroducing themselves in many ways to the world. And, the games were conducted, and suddenly this terrible event took place. And of course, some of the knee-jerk reaction is, Jews being killed, in Germany and, under, German auspices or umbrella. My personal experience was quite the opposite in terms of the reaction of the Jewish family that I was living with while I was working at the Olympics, which is that they were just heartbroken by what had happened, that they really saw this as a reintroduction of them to the world community. And Germany had rebuilt itself, and Germany was a good friend of Israel at that time, and has been ever since in so many ways. So as much as I understood what had happened in Germany in the 30s and the 40s, World War II, the Holocaust, I had the experience of how quickly things can change in the world, and there can be a reconciliation, or at least a coming to grips of historical missteps and tragedies of the past, and reinvention, and then suddenly the past, or at least circumstances in the world, collude, and suddenly you have this terrible event on German soil. So that was, and I had taken time off from school. As I said, I started at Amherst as a freshman in September of '71, and then took off the summer of '72 to go to Germany. My father had gotten me a job working in an office to perfect some of my German that summer, worked at the Olympics in September and October, and then came back to the United States. Most of the first semester of what would have been my sophomore year was over. So we went out to Colorado because we'd been skiing on the East Coast. You asked me about sports, so skiing was also a big part of my life from an early age. And went to ski at Snowmass, a beautiful planned resort outside of Aspen. And then, as long as I had missed the first semester, and skiing in Colorado was the first time I'd ever skied in the Rocky Mountains and powder and in wide open slopes, I said, this is pretty cool. Maybe I'll just stay out here and, spend the winter here, and I'll go back to school, in September. So I did that. I stayed out there and skied until March or April. And then I had another interesting experience. I had a car out there, and I took a ride out to California. This is now April, May, going into the summer of 74. And and saw Stanford University and was knocked out by what I saw on the campus of Stanford, and came back to Amherst. Actually went to UMass Amherst the summer of '74. Did my sophomore year at Amherst. Went to Harvard and completed my pre-med studies the summer of '74 at Harvard. And I had applied to transfer to Stanford, and I got in, and I transferred to Stanford for my junior and senior year. And that was just a remarkable experience, '74, '75, '76, being in San Francisco in the early to mid '70s, and everything were outside of San Francisco and Palo Alto. And I could go on and on about what Stanford was like then, and the intersection of the technology, Silicon Valley successes, and the microelectronics and computer technology, and the beginning of the whole biotechnology revolution. And that's what I was studying at Stanford, was biology and biochemistry, with Nobel Prize winners doing research at Stanford University Hospital. But the idea of going to medical school and being a nice Jewish boy, and my brother was already oriented towards law, and becoming a PhD in a sort of narrow slice of bioscience, I considered it, but medical school was on the agenda. I applied to Harvard, and I got into Harvard and proceeded in 1976 to go to Harvard Med.
What's your day like? An average day for you
Today?
I
sit with wonderful people like you, Laurie, and
well, no, really. What's your day like?
Yeah, well. So to condense 2 decades of study of medicine, clinical research, basic research in bioscience, some academic activities, and then some of the research that I was doing became of interest to a life science company in California that was working in the area of diabetes. What I was interested in was acquiring physiological signals in real time using transducers, and this company was developing an insulin pump, a company called MiniMed, and they wanted to have a continuous glucose monitor. Anyway, the work that I was doing related to the team that was developing continuous non-invasive glucose monitoring. If you have the ability to measure glucose and you have the ability to deliver insulin, in effect, you have a positive feedback loop. You have an artificial pancreas. And that company became the largest insulin pump company in the world, went public, got acquired. And all of this happened over about a 10-year period. So by the mid-90s, I'd had a liquidity event, and our family had had a liquidity event. So I had a fair amount of capital, did not have to do clinical or academic medicine. And to answer your question of what do I do every day, have taken the capital and insights to startup companies and applying technologies and working with teams to identify unmet medical needs, and then to try to fund early stage companies that meet those unmet needs, either through medical devices or diagnostics or therapeutics, mostly focusing on medical devices. So that's a significant part of the time. And over the last almost 20 years, I've been doing a lot of that in Israel, where we formed a number of companies, taken 2 of them public. One in metabolic disease, diabetes and obesity, another in structural heart, minimally invasive valve replacement, and the most recent company that we took public in cancer therapeutics with a novel internal radiation delivery system. And then at least in the United States, if you are fortunate to make money, there are a lot of incentives to form a foundation. And I'd grown up, as I said, with a balance of business in our family and literature and arts on mom's side. And we'd, from an early age, gone to museums and dance and theater, et cetera. So started a foundation about 20 years ago, prosaically named the Dr. David M. Milch Foundation.
How'd you come up with the name?
Yeah.
Did you use an ad agency for that?
It was developing that took months and months of planning and no small amount of expense, but actually a very small amount of expense. But there was actually a time in which we thought maybe to try to get away from something too hubristic, but that's how we named it. That's what it is, and we focus on 2 areas, which occupies a fair amount of my time and the team's time: youth mentoring, because in many ways I feel that the parenting that I received and teachers and role models early on, Al Mann from MiniMed and other brilliant entrepreneurs, some of the Nobel Prize winners that I was fortunate enough to work with at Stanford and at Harvard. And I learned early on, you can have someone from a very challenging background that rises above it. You can have, children from privileged backgrounds and they fall between the cracks. And so much of it has to do with the right individuals at the right time, seeing the potential in a young man or woman and telling them, regardless of your circumstances, you can achieve. Or given your privileges, if you don't rethink how you're conducting your life, things are not going to work out for you. Both ends of the spectrum. So we do youth mentoring in New York, in Harlem through a remarkable organization, Brotherhood Sister Soul, and in the South Bronx and Lower Manhattan through Sophie Gerson Healthy Youth. And then the other area is the arts. So we have something called ARS, A-R-S, in Latin, Art Veritas. Harvard, the motto is Veritas, Truth. And we call that Arts for Social Impact. And we have funded a whole variety of initiatives, theater, music, painting, performance, in the United States mostly, and in Israel, and currently have an exhibition that we've put together combining canvases and music and video, which is going to be having its debut at Brandeis University in September, then moving to the Florida Holocaust Museum, because some of the themes have to do with understanding the Holocaust through arts. And we've contributed to a definitive 2-volume work on arts and the Holocaust, which explains these two academicians, Gail Humphreys and Dr. Gail Humphreys and Dr. Karen Berman, on whose whole life has been spent on using arts to understand difficult circumstances throughout history, dislocations, ethnic cleansing, socioeconomic disparities. And this happens to be about the Holocaust. And they learned about our work, and 3 of the 36 chapters we're contributing to. We're putting a whole educational program to go with the exhibition. And our hope is to take this plus the educational component to universities and museums throughout North America. And we're already getting interest abroad as well. So that's what we do.
Okay. The name of our show is The Moment That Changed Everything. What was yours?
Well, I talked about 3rd grade, being very ill and surviving that, and the messaging that if not for the physicians and the emergency surgery, I wouldn't be around. That was a game changer, a life changer for me. Being in Munich, Germany in 1972, and being in the country which had perpetrated so much suffering on my family, and seeing how this country had turned itself around, and then suddenly tragedy striking once again, and seeing the vagaries of life and how quickly things that you thought were smoothly moving ahead can turn around, and vice versa, how things that are so challenging and tragic can suddenly turn around with the right interventions and the right insight. And probably showing up on Stanford University campus and realizing, the breadth and depth of opportunity and the doors wide open for someone with a curious mind and the willingness to apply it diligently and be open-minded to changes and to new experiences, which only continued at Stanford. So as a youngster, my personal experience, as a young adult on foreign soil, and my academic experiences where no doors were closed to me, and every opportunity was afforded, and I've built upon that ever since.
David, thank you. This has been The Moment That Changed Everything, being shot and recorded at Genius 100 Visions in Los Cabos, Mexico. David, will you join us again?
Absolutely.
Hey,
Such a
thanks so
pleasure.
much.
And I want to thank you, Lawrence. I want to thank the organizers of G100, Genius 100, Rami Kleinman, and Ambassador Ido Acharoni, and Helen Haslitz, and Hillary Viner, and Monette Malwasi. And just what they're doing here, what you're doing with us, is so necessary today with the challenges that really are mounting on so many levels. And as I've said in our conversation, with a snap of a finger, things that seem to be going well can change for the worse, and things that seem to be going nowhere but downhill can change for the better. And it all comes down to individuals making the conscious decision to do right by themselves and by others. And that's what G100 is about. That's what the communications and the connections that are being made here are about. And that's what the world needs in so many ways. And we're all participating in that.
Thank you. Honestly, thank you. This has been awesome.
Thank you, Lauren.
To learn more about how you can support G100 initiatives, visit genius100visions.com.